This is the concrete grove. The Appalachian Mountains run for over 1,300 miles, forming a long, jagged seam along the eastern edge of the United States. But they're not sharp or dramatic like the Rockies. Their peaks are old, worn smooth by time, blanketed in mist, their ridges folding over one another like sleeping forms under a wool blanket. These are soft mountains, but not easy ones. The region they shape, Appalachia, has always been defined by contrast. It is a place of deep-rooted tradition and quiet resilience, of wooded hollows and long memory. But also a place shaped by hardship, by long winters and poor soil, by extraction and abandonment, by migration and return. It's been romanticized and ridiculed, mined and mythologized, often by those who've never set foot here. But those who have lived in these mountains, who've worked them and walked their ridgelines, know a more textured truth. That life in Appalachia is often defined not by sweeping change, but by slow endurance. Not by revolutions, but by small, decisive acts. In this episode, we're exploring a set of stories bound by that idea. Not of Appalachia as a grand stage, but as a series of small, quiet moments that ripple outward. Not stories of politics or policy, not stories of progress as seen from above. These are stories you'd only notice if you stayed a while, if you sat on a porch until the light faded, if you listened more than you spoke. Each of the 5 stories centers on a seemingly minor event, a personal gesture, a choice, a defiance, but one that reshaped the community around it, even if only subtly. First, we meet a solitary man who refused to let a tree be cut down, and in doing so, preserved a piece of Appalachian legacy nearly lost to time. Then, a fiddler who played on the porch of a general store, not for fame, but for neighbors, and unknowingly seeded a sound that would echo across a nation. Next, a midwife who braved midnight trails to deliver new life, and in doing so, became a lifeline for her mountain community. After that, a librarian who carried books on horseback into isolated hollows, and opened a world of stories for those starved for words. Finally, a young coal camp girl who left chalk messages no one asked for, and changed the way her town saw itself. Together, these are stories about persistence, about place, and about how the smallest acts, if done with care, can outlast the tallest mountains. We begin with a tree and the man who wouldn't step aside. The chestnut and the man who stood still. There's a ridge above the Pigeon River in western North Carolina where the forest still grows thick and uneven, the way it does when it's been left mostly alone. Hemlocks lean over shallow ravines. Hickories creak in the wind. In the right season, the understory flushes green with ferns and mountain laurel, and the morning air tastes like moss and wood smoke. Up on that ridge sometime near the end of the 19th century, a man named Ezra Caldwell built himself a cabin out of stone and chestnut beams. He wasn't a wealthy man. He didn't have more than 30 acres of usable land, most of it stubborn with rock. But he had something that drew attention. A single, massive American chestnut tree growing in the middle of a clearing behind his house. It was enormous. Easily 8 feet around at the base, its lowest limbs higher than a man could reach on horseback. In the fall, it dropped chestnuts in noisy waves, rattling against the cabin roof, bouncing through the leaves like a soft hailstorm. Wild turkeys would come in to feed. So would neighbors, with burlap sacks and old pails. Ezra let them take what they could gather, though he always kept a few baskets for himself. He roasted chestnuts over the fire on quiet nights, cracking the shells with a flat iron and eating them slow while snow built up along the windowsills. Ezra wasn't sentimental by nature, but he talked about that tree like it was a living relative. Older, wiser, worth listening to. He said once to a neighbor, "I don't know if it remembers me, but I remember it." At the time, that wasn't so unusual. The chestnut was the backbone of these woods, not rare at all, but ubiquitous. Some estimates say that 1 in every 4 hardwood trees in the Appalachian forest was a chestnut. People built cabins and fences out of its timber. They fed their livestock on its nuts. They carved their coffins from it, and they planted chestnut saplings near graveyards as a kind of living marker. Then, around 1904, something began to change. It started in the Northeast, trees browning early, bark cracking open, branches turning brittle. A fungus no one had seen before, brought in on imported nursery stock, began to spread through the forest like a shadow moving under leaves. It was called the chestnut blight, though no one knew that name at first. They only knew the trees were dying, and nothing they tried seemed to help. The disease moved fast. It killed the young and the old. It left hillsides bare and hushed, and by the time it reached North Carolina in the 1920s, there were already stretches of mountain slope where every chestnut had fallen, standing dead in skeletal rows. Ezra saw it coming like a storm in the distance. His neighbor's trees began to wither, one by one. Then his own, all but the one in his clearing. That tree, impossibly, remained green. Its leaves unfurled each spring. Its bark stayed smooth. For reasons no one understood, it seemed untouched. Maybe it was a quirk of genetics. Maybe something peculiar in the soil. Ezra didn't want to question it too closely. He just started watching it more carefully. Visitors came. First neighbors, then folks from farther off. A professor from Asheville walked the narrow trail up to Ezra's place one summer to take leaf samples and scribble notes in a book. Ezra didn't mind, but he didn't like the way the man looked at the tree, like it was an exhibit, not a living thing. He asked the professor, "You aiming to study it or cut it down?" The man laughed, but Ezra didn't. By the fall of 1929, timber buyers had started showing up. Chestnut lumber had become a rare commodity, suddenly valuable in a way it never was before. People were salvaging the dead ones, even the rotting ones, for any wood they could sell. But a living tree that size? It was worth more than Ezra's land and cabin put together. One evening, a man in a felt hat came up in a truck with out-of-state plates. He offered Ezra $300 in cash to cut the tree and haul it out. Said the wood would be used for something important, a school building maybe. Ezra didn't answer right away. He walked the man around to the far side of the trunk and pointed to a low seam in the bark where the wood had scarred from a lightning strike 30 years back. "That's where it caught fire," he said. But it held on. Then he told the man no. Others came after that. Some were polite, some less so. One group, men Ezra didn't know, tried to take the tree while he was down in the valley for supplies. They brought a 2-man saw and an axe. But when Ezra came back early and saw them setting up camp, he didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He just stood quietly on the edge of the clearing with his rifle against his shoulder, not pointed at anything in particular, and watched. They packed up and left before dark. That winter was a hard one. The ground froze solid by November and didn't thaw until March. Ezra's crops hadn't done well, and some in the valley assumed he'd finally sell the chestnut for lumber, or at least cut it up for firewood to get by. But instead, he took in boarders, a widow with 2 young children from downriver, and traded the nuts he gathered from the tree for flour and salt pork. The family stayed through the thaw, and the children helped him plant peas along the slope. They played beneath a giant chestnut and strung a rope between its branches for a swing. In 1932, Ezra fell ill. He was in his 70s by then, and the cold didn't leave his bones the way it used to. In a brief will, written in charcoal pencil on the back of an old almanac page, he left the land to his niece, Clara. The only instruction he added was, "Don't cut the tree. It's got more work to do." Clara didn't cut it. She built a garden beneath it and let it shade the porch. Her son used to sit on the roots and read. In the summers, she let local school children come up for a picnic day, and they'd all collect fallen chestnuts into baskets. Some of those children still remember the way it smelled, sweet and earthy, almost like tobacco leaves curing in a barn. Eventually, the blight did reach that tree too. Sometime around 1949, it stopped leafing out in spring. By the fall, the bark had begun to crack and flake. Even in decline, though, it stood tall. The trunk remained upright for decades, hollowing slowly, graying like bone. Children still climbed its sturdy limbs. Couples carved their initials in its wood. A local biology teacher even brought classes up to study its structure as it weathered. By the 1970s, people in those parts were calling it Caldwell's chestnut, and foresters from the state university had taken cuttings from it in hopes of preserving whatever made it special. Some of those cuttings were grafted into hybrid saplings, part of an early effort to bring the American chestnut back from the edge of extinction. And today, on that ridge above the Pigeon River, one of those saplings has grown into a young chestnut tree about 20 feet tall. Its bark is smooth, its leaves are dark and glossy. It's not the same tree, not exactly, but it's something. And people still talk about Ezra, the man who stood by a tree when everyone else was letting theirs fall, who saw value not in what it could fetch, but in what it could shelter. It's easy to forget how much Appalachia has lost. Species, soil, songs, people, scattered like seed in a storm. But sometimes something remains. Sometimes a single tree stands when all the others go, simply because someone said no, because someone stood still. The fiddler at the general store. The road into Hiltons, Virginia, isn't much more than a winding ribbon of blacktop draped through the folds of the mountains like it's not quite sure where it's going. Most people pass through without noticing. The hills on either side rise gentle but close, the kind of terrain that feels both sheltered and a little lonely. You can't see far in any direction, just trees, fence posts, and the soft outlines of barns half hidden in kudzu. But if you had been there on a Friday evening, sometime around 1928, and if you'd stopped by the old Fields General Store just past the train depot, you might have heard something unexpected. A fiddle singing out through the warm night air. It wasn't exactly a concert. There were no tickets, no stage. Just a sagging porch in front of the store, a group of neighbors sitting on crates and split log benches, and an old man with a fiddle tucked beneath his chin, sawing out tunes that sounded like creeks running over stones. His name was Thomas Fields, and he didn't much consider himself a musician. He'd grown up on that land, worked timber as a younger man, ran cattle later on, played the fiddle mostly for himself. The instrument had been his father's, carved from local maple with a whittled-down neck and a deep belly that gave it a mellow, rounded sound. Thomas played in the key of D more than most fiddlers, said it felt like the key the mountains wanted to hear. His bowing style was slow and deliberate. He let the strings speak between the notes, with pauses like quiet breaths. And he rarely played the same tune twice in exactly the same way. Some nights, Shady Grove came out like a prayer. Other nights, it sounded like a chase through tall grass. The Friday night gatherings started by accident. Thomas's brother James owned the general store, a squat clapboard building that sold flour, nails, oilcloth, and tobacco. One spring evening after closing up, Thomas sat on the porch and began to tune the fiddle while James tallied the week's books inside. A couple of neighbors who hadn't left yet lingered. Someone brought out a jug of cider and sat down. Someone else, arriving to pick up nails, unpacked a banjo instead. Without much discussion, the first of 1,000 small porch sessions began. There was no flyer, no announcement. But by the third Friday, word had spread down through the hollows and up along the ridges. People came on foot, on mules, even in the occasional rickety truck if they could borrow one. They brought kids wrapped in quilts. They brought pies to share. One man showed up with a dulcimer strapped to his back, another with a harmonica tucked in his shirt pocket. Nobody led, and there was no formal start. The music just happened, emerging like mist, spreading through the dusk with the comfortable rhythm of old tunes known by heart. People played and people listened. Some danced, slowly, like the ground was uneven, and they'd learned not to trust their knees. Others just sat and let the music settle into them. A kind of shared remembering took place, not of specific events, but of an older way of being, when sound and silence lived closer together. There's a memory still passed around in Hiltons of one stifling July evening when it was too hot to move, the air clinging to skin like syrup. The store porch had filled up before sundown, and Thomas, seated on a crate with a lantern flickering behind him, started playing Blackberry Blossom. He played it slow, almost unrecognizable at first, dragging the melody out like smoke through a screen. A young couple sat at the edge of the crowd that night, quiet and still. The man had just returned from a coal town job he hated. The woman worked at the cannery when it was running, but hours were scarce. They didn't dance. They just sat together on the steps, listening. Later they said that Thomas's version of that tune, stretched thin and searching, felt like it belonged to them. That was the night they decided to stay in the area, to marry, and to raise their family in those same hills instead of leaving for the city. That was the thing about Thomas's playing. It didn't ask for applause. It didn't need a stage. It met people where they were and reminded them of something they didn't know they'd forgotten. Somewhere along the way, the porch became more than a porch. It became a place where songs weren't just played. They were stored. Every tune added to the living memory of that valley. And once in a while, a stranger would pass through and carry a piece of it away with them. One of those strangers was a man named Ralph Peer, a record producer from New York who came to Appalachia searching for what he called authentic American sound. He had no map for what he was seeking. But in the summer of 1927, by chance or misdirection, he found his way to Hiltons. Perhaps a missed turn or conversation at a filling station. He stopped for supplies, heard music drifting from the porch, and stayed the night. Pierre didn't record Thomas directly. He didn't even ask. But what he heard, that fiddling in D, that rhythm shaped by the land, stayed with him. When he organized what would later be known as the Bristol Sessions just a few miles away, he brought in other musicians from the region, the Carter family, Jimmy Rogers, and lesser-known locals who carried echoes of gatherings like Thomas's Porch Sessions into those early country music records. Thomas never followed that new musical trail. He stayed in Hiltons, tending a small pasture behind his cabin and playing on Fridays until his fingers grew too stiff. But the feel of his music, that slowed, breathing kind of sound, worked its way into the DNA of Appalachian string music. Not by force, not by volume, just by being there, week after week, like the creek that ran behind the store. Constant, quiet, shaping the land, one smooth stone at a time. The field's general store burned down in 1963, a lightning strike in the rafters during a summer storm. No one was hurt, but the porch and its Friday gatherings were gone. Still, the memory remains. Some nights, if you stand in the field where the store once stood, you can almost hear a faint strain of fiddle in the stillness. Not a ghost, exactly. Just a residue of sound, a held note echoing down the valley. Thomas never made a record. He never asked to. But the people who heard him play carried that music in their bones, and some of them passed it on, to children, to strangers, to microphones in borrowed barns. In that way, a quiet man on a quiet porch helped shape the way a country sounds when it remembers where it came from. The Midwife in the Hollow. High up a winding creek hollow in the great Smoky Mountains, the darkness of night was often cut by the bobbing glow of a lantern. It meant that Eliza Mullins was on her way to help somebody. For more than 30 years, Eliza was a midwife in those mountains, one of the granny women, folks called them, who delivered babies in remote cabins and hollows where doctors were scarce. She learned the art from her mother, who had learned it from hers. By the time Eliza was in her late teens, around 1900, she was already catching babies on her own, sometimes riding a mule across ridges at all hours. She carried a well-worn leather satchel stocked with the things she trusted: clean rags, a tin of lard, a bottle of carbolic for sterilizing, and a bundle of dried herbs, yarrow for bleeding, raspberry leaf for pain. Everyone knew her by the sight of that lantern and the steady, purposeful stride of the woman holding it. In those days, most births in the hollows happened at home. The nearest hospital was a day's travel and might as well have been on the moon for many families. Money was tight, roads were rough, and besides, people trusted their own. They trusted Miss Eliza. She had delivered nearly every child in that valley and the next. It was said that over all her years of work, she never lost a single mother in childbirth. A point of quiet pride for her and a source of local legend. One winter night in 1924, a fierce ice storm swept through the Smokies. The mountain creeks froze at the edges and the trees groaned under the weight of glaze ice. Just past midnight, a boy from a settlement up the hollow arrived at Eliza's door, breathless and shivering. His sister's time had come, but the baby was turned wrong and not coming. Without hesitation, Eliza lit her lantern, pulled on her heavy coat, and followed him out into the storm. The trail was slick and the wind cut through the narrow gorge, but Eliza moved steadily, one hand on the boy's shoulder to keep him from stumbling, the other gripping her lantern so the flame wouldn't gut her out. In places, fallen branches blocked the path, and they had to scramble over or detour through the underbrush. It took over an hour to reach the small cabin, its single window glowing weakly from an oil lamp inside. All through that long winter night, Eliza worked to bring the baby into the world. The labor was difficult. The child was breech. Neighbors stoked the fire high and boiled water, pouring it into ceramic jugs to act as makeshift heaters. Eliza gave the laboring mother sips of a strong raspberry leaf tea and murmured reassurances in her ear. When the baby finally slipped free just before dawn, there was a terrifying moment of silence. The infant was born not breathing. Eliza didn't panic. She cleared the airway gently with a finger, rubbed the baby's back firm with a rough towel, and puffed a few quick breaths of her own into its tiny mouth. A second later, a wail rose up, lusty and loud as a bobcat kit, and the whole cabin breathed again. By the time the sun broke over the frosted ridges, mother and child were resting, warm under quilts. Eliza, bone-tired and nearly frozen herself, stepped outside to head home. The storm had passed. In the clear morning light, she could see the whole hollow below, glazed white and silver. She allowed herself a rare smile as she poured the last of her coffee from a flask and took a sip beneath the bare oak trees. Another new life was safely here. Her work was done, at least for that day. Eliza never charged more than a few dollars for a birth, and often she accepted no money at all. She might come home from a delivery with a sack of beans, a basket of late tomatoes, or nothing but a heartfelt hug. It didn't matter to her. She often said, "We take care of our own up here." And she meant it. When a flu epidemic swept the region in the early 1930s, Eliza turned her attention to nursing the sick, riding out each morning with her satchel of herbs and a jar of mentholated salve. She sat at bedsides, cooling fevers with vinegar water and bathing aching limbs. Many people survived that winter, at least in part because she showed up. Over time, Miss Eliza became simply Granny Mullins to nearly everyone, even those older than she was. Her hair turned steel gray, and her hands grew gnarled as tree roots. But still she answered every knock at her door. By the late 1930s, a few young doctors had started practicing in the mountain towns, and the frontier nursing service had trained some midwives with modern techniques in Kentucky and Tennessee. Eliza welcomed them. She even traveled once to attend a short course on new birthing methods. But she kept to her ways for the most part, trusting in cleanliness, calm, and steady hands above all else. Young nurses who sometimes accompanied her were humbled by how much she could do in a tiny cabin with just a kettle of hot water and unwavering focus. When Eliza passed away in 1946 at the age of 67, it was as if an era quietly closed. On the day of her funeral, nearly everyone she had ever helped found their way to the little hilltop cemetery overlooking the hollow. Some came by mule, some by truck, many on foot. They gathered under a leaden sky to lay her to rest. It's said that as the pastor finished his final prayer, a break appeared in the clouds, and a sudden shaft of sunlight warmed the cold December air. In that moment, a baby in the crowd, one of Eliza's last delivered, began to laugh, and a gentle murmur rippled through the mourners. It felt less like an ending than a benediction. Her headstone was a simple one, bought with small donations from dozens of families. Beneath her name and dates, it reads, "She brought us safely into this world." In the years since, locals have kept it clean of moss and weeds. Every so often, especially on birthdays, you'll find fresh wildflowers laid gently at its base, left by grown men and women who once entered life in the steady, caring palms of Granny Mullins. The librarian on horseback. If you had stood at the mouth of Greasy Creek in eastern Kentucky on a cold autumn morning in 1938, you might have seen a curious sight. A lone woman on a horseback fording the shallow creek, her saddlebags bulging with books. Her name was Lucy Cole, and she was a pack-horse librarian, one of the many hired by a New Deal program to bring books and magazines to families tucked away in the hills. Lucy was 24, a coal miner's daughter with a high school education and a deep love of reading. When the Great Depression hit Appalachia, jobs vanished and schools closed. But people still hungered for something beyond bare survival. So Lucy and dozens of women like her saddled up and set out to deliver a different kind of relief. Words, ideas, stories. Her route wound through about 30 miles of rough mountain trails in Leslie and Harlan County, looping up craggy ridges and down into hushed hollows. 2 days a week, every week, she made the journey. In summer, the paths were choked with blackberry brambles and clouds of gnats. In winter, ice glazed the rocky inclines and water crossings. But Lucy's little sorrel mare, Sadie, knew to pick her way carefully. Even when the ground was slick red clay and the cold wind numbed Lucy's fingers on the reins. In her left saddlebag, wrapped in oilcloth, Lucy carried cherished novels and storybooks. Mark Twain, Jules Verne, the Bible too. In the right saddlebag were magazines, newspapers, often a week old, but news to those who got them. And hand-stitched scrapbooks the librarians themselves made. These scrapbooks were a local favorite. Collections of clipped recipes, home remedy poems, and pictures cut from discarded magazines. The librarians filled them with quilt patterns, weather lore, and Bible verses, tailoring each one to the interests of the families along their route. A tattered cookbook or scrapbook of mountain wisdom could be read even by those with only a little schooling, and it often became the most treasured item on a cabin's shelf. Lucy's day on the trail was long but full of human moments. At her first stop, a log house perched above a narrow creek, 3 children ran out to meet her, breathless with excitement. They knew she might bring a new Buck Rogers comic, or maybe the next Nancy Drew mystery. Their mother, apron tied tight over a worn dress, stood back shyly until Lucy handed her a neat scrapbook labeled Home Comforts. Inside were recipes for dandelion jelly and tips on keeping a drafty cabin warm. The woman's eyes lit up. She had asked for this kind of information last month, and the librarians in town had compiled what they could find. "Thank you," she whispered, holding the scrapbook to her chest like a gift. A few miles on, Lucy guided Sadie across a high footlog bridge to reach a secluded cabin under a rock bluff. An elderly couple lived there. The husband had been laid up with a mining injury. Now he sat propped by the window in a cane chair, his splinted legs stretched out, waiting for Lucy's visit as if it were medicine. For him, she brought a stack of National Geographics and a well-worn Zane Grey novel. The old man grinned toothlessly and insisted she take a jar of homemade sorghum syrup in return, despite her gentle protests. His wife, who could barely read, asked if Lucy could spare something with big, clear letters. So Lucy gave her a few pamphlets of illustrated Bible stories and spent 15 minutes reading one aloud about David and Goliath before carrying on. By midday, Lucy usually stopped in a patch of sun by a creek to water Sadie and eat a biscuit or two from her jacket pocket. Sometimes she'd read a few pages herself. She especially loved poems by Walt Whitman and kept a small cloth-bound book of them tucked in her coat. The quiet of the woods around her, the distant rush of a waterfall, and the company of words on a page made those moments feel almost sacred. In the afternoon, she climbed a steep ridge to reach a cluster of homes known locally as Possum Trot. The trail was barely more than a goat path. Sadie climbed steadily, her shoes striking sparks on hidden flints. At the top, Lucy's legs ached from the ascent. She dismounted and led Sadie the last quarter-mile for safety. At Possum Trot, a half-dozen families awaited her, gathered on a wide porch under the shade of a big oak. They greeted Lucy like kin. Here she ran a little impromptu library outpost for an hour. She laid out books on a bench, readers for the one-room schoolteacher to use in her lessons, a book of folk tales for the teenagers, a stack of farm journals for the men. While folks browsed and chatted, Lucy helped a young boy sound out words from a beginner's primer. His grandparents beamed as he carefully pronounced dog, log, fog. It was the first time anyone in their family had started to read. Before leaving, Lucy had one more task in Possum Trot. A girl named Maybelle, about 8 years old, shyly handed her a small bundle tied in cloth. Inside was a book Lucy had lent 2 weeks ago, a copy of Heidi, along with something extra, a neatly pressed wildflower, purple and white, tucked between the last pages. Lucy recognized it as a violet. Maybelle had also left a note in large, careful pencil letters. "Miss Lucy, thank you for the stories." Lucy felt a warmth in her chest as she read those words. She slipped the violet into her notebook to keep it safe. "You're most welcome, sweetheart," she said softly, though the child had already run off, blushing. As dusk approached, Lucy turned back toward town, her saddlebags considerably lighter. She hummed to Sadie as they descended through the hollows in the blue half-light. It would be full dark by the time she made it home. Her limbs were weary, and her cheeks stung with cold, but her heart was full. She thought of those children curled up by lamplight, paging through their new books, imagination stretching beyond the shadow of the next mountain. She thought of the old man easing his pain with tales of the Wild West, and the young mother already planning to try that dandelion jelly recipe. The Packhorse Library Project eventually ended in 1943, when the wartime funding shifts brought it to a close. By then, Lucy had delivered hundreds of books and thousands of hours of comfort and learning to her neighbors in the hills. In the decades that followed, many of those she served never forgot her. A few of the books she distributed survived as heirlooms, lovingly repaired and passed down. One family kept a faded scrapbook of stories and recipes that Lucy had given their grandmother. Its pages, yellowed and fragile, still bear a faint scent of wood smoke from the cabin where it lived. Lucy herself went on to become a school librarian in town after the war, but she often missed the days of riding out. There was something about handing a book to a child in their own home, she told a friend years later. Watching their eyes light up out there on the porch, that was the best work I ever did. She never married or had children of her own, but in a sense, she helped raise an entire generation of readers. Those children grew up and told their own kids about the book lady on horseback who used to appear, like clockwork, with treasures bound in cloth and paper. If you visit certain mountain schools or little county libraries in eastern Kentucky today, you might find in a glass case or on a high shelf a worn-out book with a note explaining how it arrived by mule's saddle a long time ago. And if you wander down a quiet creek bed at dawn, you might even catch yourself listening for the soft clop of hooves carrying stories around the next bend. The Girl and the Coal Tipple. In the steep folds of Fayette County, West Virginia, there's an old coal camp called Kmore. It clings to the side of the New River Gorge like a stubborn memory, half carved into the gray rock, half swallowed by forest. Time has washed most of it away. Roofs have caved in. Iron railings have rusted to lace. But the bones are still there. The long incline track, the stacked stone foundations, and the hulking skeleton of the tipple. That massive iron chute where coal was once dumped, sorted, and funneled into waiting rail cars below. Back in the 1910s and 20s, Kmore was home to a few hundred miners and their families, nearly all of them tied to the same daily rhythm. Dawn whistle, 12-hour shifts underground, coal dust in the teeth, a company store where wages vanished as fast as they came. It was a closed world of owned land, owned houses, and tightly held destinies. In one of those identical clapboard houses lived the Raines family. Mother, father, 4 children, and a dog that would sleep beneath whichever child's bed was warmest. The youngest daughter, Anna Raines, was about 10 years old when her small story begins. She wasn't strong like her brothers, or loud like the boys who raced up and down the rickety plank sidewalks. But she was watchful. She noticed things. The dark crescents under her mother's eyes after long days, the way her father leaned a little harder on the railing each evening when he climbed the porch steps. She noticed how coal grit crept into every corner of the house, behind the dishes, between the pages of books, even into her dreams. Anna didn't have many toys. Her favorites were a bit of twine, a found marble, and a nub of chalk her teacher had given her one afternoon. Just a scrap, worn soft at the edges. She kept that piece of chalk wrapped in a scrap of cloth inside a small pouch, a pouch her mother stitched from an old apron. It felt like a secret talisman to Anna. Something small and bright she could hold on to in a place that was mostly dark. Most days after school, when chores were done, Anna wandered near the looming tipple. Children weren't supposed to play around it. It was dangerous, always rumbling or dripping or moaning under the weight of coal and machinery. But she was careful. She liked the way her voice would echo if she stood beneath the steel beams, how even the slightest whisper came back magnified, as if the structure itself was speaking in return. One evening, close to dusk, Anna did something simple. She climbed the tipple's access stairs, not all the way up, just to the first platform. And on a blackened iron sheet near the chute, she wrote 3 words in chalk: "The Mountain Watches." She didn't think it was important. It was just a phrase that drifted into her mind, maybe borrowed from a story she'd heard or a daydream from the woods. But something about the act, climbing up there alone, writing without permission, made her heart pound in her chest the whole way home. She hid the chalk at the bottom of her apron pocket afterward and said nothing of it. The next morning, that little message was still there, dusty white on the soot-black metal. Miners walking to the entrance drift paused beneath it. One pointed it out. Another muttered something about ghosts, A few just shrugged and moved on. But the phrase lingered in the air. It was odd. Not angry, not clear. Just present. Like a single firefly in the dark. Later that week, someone added a second phrase beneath hers, also in chalk. It appeared overnight. No witnesses. No explanation. Let the holler breathe. No one knew who wrote it, or if they did, they kept quiet. But after that, more messages followed, one every week or so. Short, cryptic, sometimes poetic. We are not soot. Roots, remember. Beneath this rock, a spring. It became a quiet ritual. Each week, a new message would be found scrawled on the tipple. Never signed, always small, always in that ephemeral chalk. The company men didn't like it. They suspected it was a sign of protest or some kind of joke at their expense. At one point, a foreman ordered the messages scrubbed off, and for a while they disappeared. But the following week, in the very same spot, a new chalked line appeared. You can scrape stone. You can't scrape thought. By then, people in Kaymore had started to deliberately look for the messages each day. On their way to the mine incline, they'd pause and crane their necks up at the tipple support beams. They'd whisper about the latest words at the company store or while waiting for their shifts. Children speculated in the schoolyard about who the writer might be. Some said it was a ghost, maybe a miner who had died in the mine years ago. Others claimed it was Old Man Harper, the union organizer, trying a new tactic. A few of Anna's classmates even teased that it was her, since she was always so quiet. She just blushed and shook her head. Through it all, Anna stayed silent. She never told anyone, not even her mother, that it had begun with her. To Anna, it wasn't rebellion, not in the way adults understood it. She didn't want to get anyone in trouble or cause a strike. She just wanted to say something, anything, that felt like her own, in a place where every wall was black with dust and every word seemed to come from above. For her, that little chalk felt like light, brief, visible, gone again with the next rain, but real. Over time, the tone of the messages shifted. Some became practical bits of advice, as if whoever was writing had taken on the role of a village wise woman or wise man. Boil water twice. Wash fruit before the whistle. Other messages were gentle and kind. Your hands are not just for work. The wind does not judge. A few were even playful. One morning, someone had scrawled, "Bet the mules are smarter than us." It earned a round of chuckles, even from the gruff men heading into the mine, though even that humor carried a bit of truth in its belly. In a place shaped so deeply by work and hierarchy, these little phrases reminded people that there were other ways to speak, other things worth noticing and saying. In the fall of 1935, a flood swept through the gorge. It wasn't a catastrophic one, not like the legendary Big Flood of 19. But it was enough to loosen a few shanties from their stilts and send debris swirling into the river. For a day or two, the town fell silent. Work paused. The mine shut down while the entrance was cleared. Families focused on checking on neighbors and shoveling mud. When the sun finally broke through the clouds, drying the soaked holler, a new chalk message appeared on the tipple. The water rose, and we were still here. That one stuck. For weeks, no one dared scrub it off. Even the foremen let it be, Under that simple sentence was an echo of quiet pride and relief that everyone understood. They were still here. By then, most folks had stopped wondering who the writer was. It didn't seem to matter anymore. The messages had become part of the landscape, like the rickety mine cars and the ever-present coal dust, but somehow lighter, like a bird song in a sooty world. Anna eventually grew up and left Kmore. In the 1940s, after her father's death, her family moved east and she trained as a nurse. She never came back to live in the coal camp. But before she left, Anna quietly slipped her little piece of chalk into the bottom drawer of her mother's kitchen hutch. She didn't explain why, but she figured if anyone in the family ever needed to write something true, they'd know where to find it. Years passed. The mine closed in the 1960s. The houses emptied out. The forest crept back in, slowly but surely. Today, what's left of Kmore is part of a national park. Hikers can descend the steep wooden steps to the old mine works. Most of the iron and steel lies rusting. New informational signs tell the official story of coal and labor and geology. But if you wander off the main path, to the north side of the ruined tipple, and look carefully at a low steel plate sheltered by an overhang, you can still make out a few faint white lines. They're nearly illegible now, but locals who know them will tell you one of the lines says, "We were here. We watched. We mattered." No plaque marks it. No ranger mentions it on a tour. But it's there, the echo of a child's handwriting in chalk, still clinging to the bones of a long silence machine. In a place where nearly everything was taken. The timber, the coal, the very land itself. Those small words remain. Not to resist necessarily, just to remind. Conclusion. 5 small acts. A man who refused to cut down a tree. A fiddler who played because it felt right. A midwife who braved midnight trails to deliver new life. A librarian who carried words on a horseback through the hills. A girl who wrote on the bones of a machine. None of them expected to be remembered. None of them had a plan for legacy. They lived quiet lives, bound to soil, to neighbors, to the long breath of the hills. And what they left behind was not carved in marble or trumpeted in history books. It was written in tree rings, on porch boards, in fading chalk, in dog-eared pages, and in the careful ink of family Bibles. Appalachia is filled with stories like these. Not loud, not heroic in the usual sense, but steady, persistent, made of observation and care. A land like this teaches people to notice what lasts, to find meaning not in spectacle, but in what remains after time has done its slow, patient work. In Ezra Caldwell's clearing, new chestnut saplings reach upward, not just toward the sun, but toward an idea that some things are worth protecting even when they're doomed. In Hiltons, old-time music still drifts out of back porches and fiddle festivals, shaped by hands that learned from hands that learned from someone like Thomas. In the Smoky Mountains, a hilltop cemetery holds a midwife's grave, still adorned with wildflowers by the families she once served. In eastern Kentucky, a few frayed books passed from hand to hand still carry the stamp of a pack-horse library. Reminders of a time when words arrived on horseback. And in Kmore, a quiet message in chalk. "We were here," still clings to rusted metal, offering a whisper of belonging in a place many have forgotten. These are not grand histories. but they are anchors. Small, weighty truths that tether people to a place and to each other. This is what endures. Not always what is built, but what is refused to be erased. Thank you for spending time in the concrete grove. Until next time, may the soft ridgelines and still hollows of Appalachia linger with you, not for their grandeur, but for their grace. Good night.